The sun hung low over the Arizona territory like a blood orange, painting the dusty main street of Redemption Springs in hues of amber and crimson, as Tamara Owens clutched her tattered shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders. The year was 1878, and the town that had once been her home now felt like a prison of whispers and contempt. 3 months had passed since she'd stumbled back into Redemption Springs after surviving the Apache raid that had claimed her family's homestead and the lives of her parents and younger brother. Most folks believed no white woman could survive such an ordeal without losing something more precious than her life, her virtue, and the townsfolk made their opinions known with every passing day. "Filthy squaw lover," came the whispered words as Tamara passed the general store, her eyes fixed on the weathered boardwalk beneath her feet. She was 22 years old and felt twice that age, the weight of survival heavy on her shoulders. Her once vibrant copper hair hung limp around her gaunt face, her green eyes dulled by memories she fought daily to suppress. The scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline had healed, but it served as a visible reminder of what she'd endured and what the townspeople assumed about her. The dirt kicked up around her worn boots as she hurried toward Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, where she'd been permitted to stay and work as a maid, the only person in town who'd offered her shelter when she returned. Even there, Mrs. Fletcher kept her out of sight when guests were present, worried that Tamara's tainted presence might drive away business. "You there, Miss Owens?" The booming voice halted Tamara in her tracks. She turned slowly to face Sheriff Mills, his gray mustache twitching with annoyance. "Yes, Sheriff. Got complaints about you walking through town at this hour. Folks are sitting down to supper with their families." His implication was clear: she wasn't considered fit company for decent folk. "I'm just heading back to the boarding house, Sheriff. Mrs. Fletcher's expecting me." "See that you hurry along, then." He adjusted his gun belt meaningfully. "And consider using the alley next time." Tamara nodded, swallowing the bitter retort that rose in her throat. She'd done nothing wrong except survive, yet here she was, treated like a criminal. As she turned to continue her journey, a commotion at the far end of the street caught her attention. A group of riders was approaching, trail dust clinging to their clothing, the late afternoon sun glinting off their saddles and the firearms at their sides. Newcomers to Redemption Springs were rare, especially a group this size. The riders came to a stop outside the saloon, and Tamara couldn't help but pause to observe them. 5 men dismounted, stretching their legs after what appeared to be a long journey. 4 of them were typical cowboys, weathered, rough-looking men who'd spent their lives under the harsh western sun. But the 5th man, he was different. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with a fluid grace that belied his size. His dark brown hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but when he glanced up, scanning the street with a watchful gaze, Tamara caught a glimpse of striking blue eyes beneath the brim. A neatly trimmed beard framed a strong jaw, and unlike his companions, his clothes, while dusty from the trail, appeared to be of better quality. As if sensing her scrutiny, the man's gaze shifted, landing directly on Tamara. For a moment, their eyes locked across the distance, and Tamara felt an unexpected jolt. There was no judgment in his look, only curiosity and perhaps a hint of something else she couldn't name. The spell was broken by a rough hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Ed Simmons, the blacksmith's son, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Looking for new customers, Tamara," he sneered, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "Herd Injuns pay well for white women who already know how to spread there." His words were cut short as Tamara yanked herself free, stumbling backward. Her foot caught on a loose board, and she found herself falling, landing hard in the dusty street. Pain shot through her wrist as she tried to break her fall. Ed loomed over her, laughing now. "Look at the Apache whore, right where she belongs, in the dirt." His cruel laughter attracted attention, and several townspeople stopped to watch the spectacle. No one moved to help her. No one ever did. Tamara struggled to her feet, cradling her throbbing wrist, her cheeks burning with humiliation. A glob of spittle landed at her feet, followed by another that caught the hem of her skirt. She didn't need to look up to know more would follow. That's enough. The voice cut through the growing murmurs like a knife deep, commanding, and edged with steel. The crowd parted as the stranger from the group of riders strode forward, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. Up close, Tamara could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of long days squinting into the sun. "This how you treat ladies in this town?" He asked, his voice deceptively calm as he positioned himself between Tamara and her tormentors. Ed puffed up his chest. "She ain't no lady. She's been living with savages for months." Came back claiming they kept her prisoner, but everyone knows. "I didn't ask what everyone knows," the stranger interrupted. "I asked if this is how you treat women in this town." Sheriff Mills pushed his way through the gathering crowd. "Now see here, stranger, you don't know the situation." "I know what I see," the stranger replied, his gaze steady. "A woman being harassed by men who ought to know better." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm Brody Vance, just arrived with cattle for the Triple R Ranch north of here." The sheriff's demeanor shifted immediately at the mention of the Triple R, the largest and wealthiest ranch in the territory. "Mr. Vance, my apologies for the disturbance. This is a local matter." "Appears to be a matter of basic decency," Brody countered. He turned slightly, addressing Tamara directly for the first time. "You all right, madam?" Tamara, unused to such civility after months of scorn, could only nod. Ed spat again, this time deliberately aiming closer to Tamara's feet. "She's Apache filth now. You want to defend her, Vance? Then you can join her in the dirt." Before anyone could react, Ed spat again, this time hitting Brody's boot. The crowd grew silent, tension thickening the air. Brody looked down at his boot, then back up at Ed, his expression unchanged except for a dangerous glint in his blue eyes. "They spat on her for what she survived," Brody said, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "Then let them spit on me too." With those words, he offered his arm to Tamara. "May I escort you to where you're headed, Miss Owens?" she supplied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tamara Owens." Tamara hesitated only briefly before placing her trembling hand on his offered arm. The simple act of human kindness nearly undid her completely. "You're making a mistake, Vance," Sheriff Mills called after them as Brody began leading Tamara away. "That woman's trouble. Seems to me the only trouble here is how quick folks are to judge," Brody replied without turning around. As they walked away from the crowd, Tamara could feel the weight of the town's stares on her back. But for the first time in months, she stood a little straighter, her chin lifted just a fraction higher, because a stranger had seen her as a person worth defending. "Where were you headed?" Brody asked quietly once they'd put some distance between themselves and the crowd. "Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house," Tamara replied. "I work there." Brody nodded, maintaining a respectful distance while still offering his arm for support. "I'll see you safely there." They walked in silence for several moments, Tamara acutely aware of the man beside her. He smelled of leather, horses, and the open prairie clean scents that reminded her of the life she'd had before everything changed. "Thank you," she finally said. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Brody replied simply, as if standing up for a stranger being mistreated was the most natural thing in the world. They reached the boarding house all too quickly. A modest two-story building with a small porch, it was one of the better-maintained structures in Redemption Springs. Tamara reluctantly removed her hand from Brody's arm. "This is where I'll leave you, Mr. Vance. Thank you again." Brody touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Owens." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever happened to you, it doesn't give them the right to treat you that way." Tamara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the simple validation nearly her undoing. She quickly turned and hurried up the steps into the boarding house, unable to trust herself to speak. Once inside, she leaned against the closed door, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in months, not from fear or dread, but from something she'd almost forgotten: hope. From the small window beside the door, she watched as Brody Vance stood for a moment longer, looking at the boarding house as if committing it to memory. Then he turned and walked back toward the saloon, his tall figure straight and proud against the setting sun. For the first time since she'd returned to Redemption Springs, Tamara felt something other than shame and despair. She didn't know who Brody Vance was beyond a name and an unexpected act of kindness, but in that moment, she knew one thing with certainty: her life had just changed again. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of pristine blue sky that made the Arizona Territory both beautiful and unforgiving. Tamara rose early, as was her habit since returning to town. Nightmares still plagued her sleep, fragments of memories from her captivity that jolted her awake in the darkest hours. It was easier to greet the day than to battle the demons of the night. She moved quietly through her small attic room, washing her face in the basin of cold water she'd drawn the night before. The boarding house was silent below her. The other occupants wouldn't stir for at least another hour. This early morning solitude was precious to Tamara, the only time she felt truly at peace. As she dressed in her simple work dress, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small, cracked mirror propped against the wall. The woman who stared back at her was a stranger, sometimes thinner, harder, with shadows beneath her eyes that never seemed to fade. The scar along her face had healed to a thin, silvery line, but it would always be there, a permanent reminder of what she'd endured. Her thoughts drifted to the previous evening and to Brody Vance. His unexpected kindness had left her unsettled, stirring emotions she'd thought long buried. Hope was dangerous. She'd learned that lesson well. Better to expect nothing and be prepared for the worst. The floorboard creaked beneath her feet as she made her way downstairs to begin her morning chores. Mrs. Fletcher was already in the kitchen, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun, her movements efficient as she prepared breakfast for the boarders. "You're later than usual," the older woman commented without looking up from the dough she was kneading. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Fletcher. It won't happen again." Mrs. Fletcher sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Heard about what happened in town yesterday." Her tone wasn't unkind, but there was a wariness to it. "That new fellow from the Triple R caused quite a stir standing up for you like that." Tamara kept her eyes on the kindling she was arranging in the stove. "He was just being decent. Decent or not, it stirred up talk. Again, Mrs. Fletcher studied Tamara with an unreadable expression. "Sheriff Mills came by last night after you'd gone up, said that trouble follows you now and he can't guarantee the safety of my establishment if I keep you on." A cold dread settled in Tamara's stomach. Are you asking me to leave?" Mrs. Fletcher was silent for a long moment. "No," she finally said. "Not yet, but I need you to stay out of sight more, work in the back, don't go into town unless absolutely necessary." She hesitated. "And that Cowboy Vance, it would be best if you stayed clear of him. Men like that pass through, cause a stir, and then they're gone, and we're left picking up the pieces." Relief mingled with resignation in Tamara's chest. She wasn't being turned out, not today, at least, but her already small world was shrinking even further. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for not sending me away." Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened slightly. "I don't hold with how folks have been treating you, Tamara. What happened wasn't your fault, but I'm running a business here, and I can't afford to have the whole town turn against me." Tamara nodded, understanding the impossible position Mrs. Fletcher was in. The older woman had shown more kindness than most by giving Tamara shelter and work when she'd returned to town, half dead and completely alone. "Now get those biscuits in the oven, Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice returning to its usual brisk tone. "And then fetch more water from the well." The morning passed in a blur of familiar tasks: cooking, cleaning, washing dishes, and preparing rooms for new arrivals. Around midday, while Tamara was hanging laundry in the backyard, she heard the front bell ring, signaling a visitor. Normally, she would have hurried inside to assist Mrs. Fletcher, but remembering their conversation, she remained where she was, hidden from view of the street. The murmur of voices drifted through the open kitchen window, Mrs. Fletcher's, and a deeper voice that sent an unexpected shiver down Tamara's spine. "Brody Vance. Just checking if you have rooms available for myself and my men," he was saying. "We'll be in town a few days sorting out business for Mr. Richardson at the Triple R." "I have 3 rooms available," Mrs. Fletcher replied, her voice carrying the professional warmth she reserved for customers. "How many in your party?" "5 total, but we can double up." "The rooms are $2 a night each, meals included." That's fair, Brody replied. We'll take them. There was the sound of coins being counted out, and then Brody's voice again, lower this time. Is Miss Owens around? I wanted to make sure she was all right after yesterday. A pause. Miss Owens is very busy with her duties, Mrs. Fletcher said, her tone cooling noticeably. And if I may be so bold, Mr. Vance, she's had enough trouble without adding more. She's under my protection here. I assure you, madam, I mean her no harm, Brody replied, his voice level. Quite the opposite. That may be your intention, but intentions and consequences don't always align, Mrs. Fletcher countered. Now, if you and your men will return around 4, your rooms will be ready. Another pause then. Of course. Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. The front door closed, and Tamara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Part of her was disappointed that Mrs. Fletcher had sent Brody away, while another part was relieved. The last thing she needed was more attention, more reason for the town to turn against her. She returned to her laundry, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest at the thought that Brody had inquired after her welfare. It meant nothing, she told herself sternly. He was just being polite. Later that afternoon, as Tamara was cleaning one of the guest rooms, Mrs. Fletcher appeared in the doorway. Mr. Vance and his men will be staying here, she said without preamble. I've put them in the rooms at the far end of the hall, away from your attic stairs. I expect you to keep your distance. Tamara nodded, keeping her eyes on the bedsheet she was smoothing. Yes, Mrs. Fletcher, the older woman sighed. It's for your own good, Tamara. Men like Brody Vance, they have reputations. He's Richardson's right-hand man, brought in from Texas to handle the rough business. They say he's quick with a gun and has a past he doesn't talk about. This information surprised Tamara. Brody hadn't struck her as a gunslinger. There had been a steadiness to him, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with the hot-headed gunslingers she'd encountered before. I'll stay out of his way, Tamara promised, ignoring the small pang of disappointment the words brought. True to her word, when Brody and his men arrived at the boarding house that evening, Tamara made herself scarce. She served their dinner in the dining room and then quickly retreated to the kitchen, letting Mrs. Fletcher handle their other needs. If Brody noticed her deliberate avoidance, he gave no sign of it, though she felt his eyes following her during the brief moments she was in his presence. For 3 days, Tamara maintained this careful distance, glimpsing Brody only in passing as he and his men came and went from the boarding house. They spent their days at the Triple R and their evenings in town, presumably at the saloon, returning late each night. Tamara would hear their boot steps in the hallway below her attic room, sometimes accompanied by low laughter or conversation. On the 4th day, however, fate intervened in her careful avoidance. Tamara had risen before dawn, as was her habit, and decided to fetch water from the well while the town was still sleeping. The air was cool and fresh, stars still visible in the gradually lightening sky as she made her way to the well at the edge of the property. She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice the figure leaning against the well until she was almost upon him. Brody straightened as she approached, his hat in his hands. "Miss Owens," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying in the still morning air. Tamara froze, the empty water bucket clutched in her hands. "Mr. Vance, I didn't expect anyone to be up at this hour." "I've always been an early riser," he replied. "The dawn has a way of putting things in perspective." She hesitated, uncertain whether to continue forward or retreat back to the house. Propriety dictated she shouldn't be alone with a man, especially not in the dim light of early morning, but propriety seemed a hollow concern given what the town already thought of her. "Were you waiting for me?" She asked directly, surprising herself with her boldness. A small smile touched Brody's lips. "Yes," he admitted, "Mrs. Fletcher has been very effective at keeping you away from me. I figured this might be my only chance to speak with you privately. Mrs. Fletcher is protecting me," Tamara said, though from what, she wasn't entirely sure anymore. "Is that what she's doing?" Brody asked, his blue eyes studying her intently. "Seems to me like she's hiding you away, like something to be ashamed of." The words struck a nerve, but Tamara lifted her chin. "She gave me shelter when no one else would. I owe her my loyalty." Brody nodded, accepting this. "Fair enough." He moved aside, gesturing to the well. "Don't let me keep you from your chores." Tamara approached cautiously, setting her bucket down on the edge of the well. As she began to lower it, Brody spoke again. I heard some of what happened to you, bits and pieces from town gossip. Tamara's hands stilled on the rope. People talk a lot, most of it isn't true. I figured as much. Brody leaned against the well, his proximity sending an unexpected warmth through Tamara despite the cool morning air. Would you tell me? The truth, I mean. No one had asked for her side of the story before. They'd all assumed the worst, that she'd been violated repeatedly, that she'd become a willing companion to her captors, that she'd betrayed her race, her gender, her very nature. The accusations varied, but the contempt remained constant. Why would you want to know? She asked, genuinely curious. Brody was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the lightening horizon. Because I know what it's like to be judged for surviving something others don't understand. There was a weight to his words, a depth of experience that resonated with something inside Tamara. For the first time in months, she felt a connection to another human being, a tentative bridge across the vast loneliness that had engulfed her since her return. My family had a homestead about 20 miles west of here, she began, her voice soft but steady. My father, mother, younger brother, and me, we'd been there 3 years, built something good. She paused, the memories both painful and precious. The Apache raiding party came at dawn, 4 braves and their leader. They killed my father first while he was tending the horses. My mother and brother were inside with me. Brody remained silent, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. My mother hid us in the root cellar, but they found us. They killed her and… Tamara's voice faltered for the first time. They killed my brother Thomas when he tried to protect me. He was only 15. I'm sorry, Brody said softly. Tamara nodded, acknowledging his sympathy before continuing. They took me with them. I thought they would kill me too, or worse. But the leader, Natata, was his name. He had other plans. His daughter had died of fever the winter before, and in some strange way he saw me as a replacement, not as a wife or what people in town think, but as a daughter to be taught their ways. You were a captive, but not in the way people assume, Brody said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Yes, I was a prisoner, but I wasn't. She couldn't bring herself to say the words. They taught me to survive. How to find water in the desert, which plants were safe to eat, how to move without leaving tracks. I think Natata believed that if I learned their ways, I might eventually become one of them willingly. But you escaped, Tamara nodded, after 3 months. There was a clash with soldiers from Fort Williams. In the chaos, I ran. I walked for 2 days before a hunting party from town found me. Her hands tightened on the well rope. I was half dead, delirious from the sun, when I told them what had happened, how I'd survived. That's when the whispers started. They couldn't believe I'd been with the Apache for months and remained untouched. So they decided you must be lying, Brody concluded, anger edging his voice, or worse, that I'd become a willing companion, a traitor. Tamara finally looked directly at him, vulnerability and defiance mingled in her gaze. No one asked what it cost me to survive. They just spat on what I'd endured because it didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. The first rays of the sun crested the eastern horizon, bathing them both in golden light. In that moment, with her story laid bare, Tamara felt a strange liberation. Whatever Brody thought of her now, at least he knew the truth. Thank you, he said simply, for trusting me with your story. Now you know why the town treats me as they do. Brody shook his head. I know that they're wrong, that they're afraid of what they don't understand. He stepped closer, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Surviving doesn't make you less, Tamara. It makes you more, stronger, braver than any of them. His words washed over her like a healing balm, touching places inside her that had been raw and bleeding for months. Tears pricked at her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. I should get back, she said, suddenly aware of how long they'd been talking. Mrs. Fletcher will be looking for me. Brody stepped back, giving her space. Of course, he hesitated. I'll be in town a few more days. I'd like to talk with you again if you're willing. Tamara knew she should refuse. That further association with Brody would only fuel the town's gossip, but the connection she felt with him was too precious to dismiss. I walk to the mercantile every afternoon around 3, she said. Mrs. Fletcher sends me for supplies. Brody nodded, understanding her implicit invitation. I might find myself in need of supplies around that time as well. Tamara lowered her bucket into the well, fighting to keep a small smile from her lips. As she drew up the water, she felt Brody's eyes on her, not judgmental or predatory, but appreciative in a way that made her feel seen as a woman, not just as a victim or an object of scorn. "Good day, Mr. Vance," she said as she lifted her now full bucket. "Good day, Miss Owens," he replied, settling his hat back on his head with a tip of the brim. "Until this afternoon." As Tamara walked back to the boarding house, the weight of her water bucket was substantial, but for the first time in months, the weight on her heart felt just a little lighter. True to her word, Tamara set out for the mercantile at precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher's shopping list tucked into the pocket of her faded blue dress. The summer heat pressed down on the town like a physical weight, the air shimmering above the dusty street. Few people were about at this hour, most having retreated indoors to escape the punishing sun. Tamara kept her head down as she walked, a habit formed over months of avoiding hostile stares. She was so focused on her path that she nearly collided with a figure stepping out from between two buildings. "Well, if it ain't the Apache whore," drawled a familiar voice. Ed Simmons blocked her path, his hat pushed back on his head, a mean smile twisting his features. The smell of whiskey hung about him, though it was barely mid-afternoon. "Please let me pass, Ed," Tamara said, trying to sidestep him. Ed shifted, keeping himself in her way. "Not so high and mighty without your new protector, are you?" He stepped closer, forcing Tamara to back up. "That fancy cowboy won't be around forever. Then what'll you do?" "I managed before he arrived. I'll manage after he's gone." Tamara tried to keep her voice steady, but fear bubbled just beneath the surface. Ed had always been trouble, even before her captivity, known for his meanness and quick temper. "I don't think so," Ed replied, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. "I think it's time you learned your place in this town." Tamara struggled against his grip, panic rising in her chest. "Let go of me, or what? You'll call your Apache friends," Ed laughed, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "Maybe I should show you how a real man treats," the distinctive click of a gun being cocked cut through Ed's threat like a knife. "I suggest you reconsider your next move very carefully," came Brody's voice, cold and measured. Ed froze, his eyes widening as he glanced over Tamara's shoulder. "This ain't your business, Vance. I'm making it my business." Brody stepped into view, his revolver aimed squarely at Ed's chest. "Take your hand off the lady. Now." For a tense moment, Ed seemed to consider defying the order. Then, with a sneer, he released Tamara's arm, shoving her slightly as he did so. "She ain't worth dying over," Ed spat. "No," Brody agreed, his aim never wavering. "You aren't worth hanging over either, so I suggest you walk away while you still can." Ed backed up slowly, hands raised slightly. "This ain't over," he muttered before turning and stalking away. Brody holstered his gun with a fluid motion that spoke of years of practice. "Are you all right?" he asked Tamara, his voice gentle in contrast to the steel it had held moments before. Tamara rubbed her arm where Ed's fingers had dug in, certain there would be bruises by morning. "Yes," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Thank you." "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," Brody said, genuine regret in his expression. "Got held up at the Triple R." He glanced down the street where Ed had disappeared. "That man's trouble. He always has been," Tamara agreed, "but he's the blacksmith's son and they need the blacksmith in town, so." She left the implications hanging how the town overlooked Ed's behavior because of his father's necessary trade. Brody's jaw tightened, but he didn't comment further on Ed. Instead, he offered his arm. "May I accompany you to the mercantile? I really do need to pick up a few things." Tamara hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his arm. The solid warmth of him was reassuring after her encounter with Ed. As they walked together down the main street, Tamara was acutely aware of the stares they attracted. Windows that had been shuttered against the heat suddenly showed faces peering out. The few people on the street stopped to watch them pass. "You're causing quite a stir in town," Tamara murmured, keeping her eyes forward. "Good," Brody replied, surprising her. "Maybe it'll make them think." "Or it'll make things worse for me when you leave." Tamara countered, voicing the fear that had been growing since their conversation that morning. Brody slowed his steps, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. What if I don't leave? The question hung between them, loaded with implications Tamara wasn't sure she was ready to consider. You have a job with the Triple R, she reminded him. And I doubt Mr. Richardson would appreciate his right-hand man associating with someone like me. Someone like you, Brody repeated, a hint of frustration in his tone. A survivor, a woman of courage and resilience. You speak as if you're something shameful, Tamara. In this town I am, she replied simply. They reached the Mercantile, a large wooden building with a covered porch running its length. Before they entered, Brody stopped, turning to face Tamara fully. Then perhaps this isn't the right town, he said quietly. Before Tamara could respond, the Mercantile door swung open, and Mrs. Prescott, the owner's wife, stepped out. Her eyes widened at the sight of them together, her thin lips pressing into a disapproving line. Mr. Vance, she acknowledged with a nod, pointedly ignoring Tamara's presence. We've just received a shipment of fine tobacco from back east, if you're interested. Thank you, madam, Brody replied politely, but I believe Miss Owens was here first. Mrs. Prescott's face soured as if she'd bitten into a lemon. Of course, she said stiffly. Though I should warn you, Mr. Vance, that associating with certain elements in town might affect how others view you, especially someone representing the Triple R. Brody's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Prescott, but I've always made my own judgments about people. With that, he ushered Tamara into the store, his hand a gentle pressure at the small of her back. The interior was cool and dim after the bright sunlight outside, the air rich with the scents of coffee, leather, and dried goods. Mr. Prescott stood behind the counter, a tall, thin man with spectacles perched on his nose. His expression mirrored his wife's when he saw Tamara, but the sight of Brody tempered his obvious distaste. What can I get for you today? He asked, addressing Brody rather than Tamara. The lady has a list, Brody replied, nodding toward Tamara. Reluctantly, Mr. Prescott turned his attention to her. Well, Tamara withdrew Mrs. Fletcher's list from her pocket and handed it over. Mrs. Fletcher's weekly order. As Mr. Prescott began gathering the items, moving between shelves and barrels with practiced efficiency, Tamara became aware of whispered conversation from the far corner of the store. Two women, Mrs. Blackburn and Mrs. Taylor, wives of prominent ranchers, were watching her and Brody, their heads close together as they exchanged what were undoubtedly unflattering observations. Brody noticed too, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. But rather than ignoring the women as Tamara had learned to do, he guided her toward them, tipping his hat politely. Afternoon, ladies, he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone in the store. Beautiful day, isn't it? The women, caught in their gossip, straightened with matching expressions of surprise and discomfort. Mr. Vance, Mrs. Blackburn acknowledged, her eyes darting between him and Tamara. Yes, lovely weather we're having. Have you met Miss Owens? Brody continued, his hand returning to the small of Tamara's back in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. We're acquainted, Mrs. Taylor replied stiffly. Wonderful, Brody smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Then you must know what an extraordinary woman she is. Surviving an ordeal that would have broken most people, and with such dignity despite the challenges she's faced since returning. The women exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond to such direct praise of someone they'd been actively ostracizing. Mr. Vance, Mrs. Blackburn began, her voice lowered as if sharing a confidence. You may not be aware of the circumstances of Miss Owens's captivity. There are certain improprieties that I'm fully aware of Miss Owens's history, Brody interrupted, his tone remaining conversational but with an edge of steel beneath. She shared it with me herself, a remarkable story of courage and survival. The women seemed taken aback by this direct confrontation of the town's collective judgment. Mrs. Taylor recovered first, a tight smile fixing itself on her face. Well, it's certainly commendable of you to take such an interest in her welfare, she said, the implication clear in her tone. It's not charity, Mrs. Taylor, Brody replied evenly. It's respect, something I was raised to show to all people, especially those who have endured hardship with grace. Before either woman could respond, Mr. Prescott called from the counter. Your order's ready, Miss Owens. Tamara moved to retrieve her packages, acutely aware of the tension humming in the air. She paid for Mrs. Fletcher's goods from the money the older woman had provided, careful to keep her eyes down as Mr. Prescott counted out her change with obvious reluctance. Brody quickly selected a few items for himself: tobacco, coffee, and a small package of hard candies, paying for them efficiently before returning to Tamara's side. Allow me, he said, taking the heaviest of her parcels despite her protests. My mother would turn in her grave if she saw me letting a lady carry such a load. As they stepped back out into the afternoon sun, Tamara finally found her voice. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Done what? Brody asked, adjusting his hat against the glare. Confronted them like that, associated yourself with me so publicly. She shook her head. You don't understand what it's like here, how quickly they'll turn on you too. Brody stopped walking, turning to face her fully. I understand exactly what it's like here, Tamara. I've seen towns like this before, scared of anything different, anyone who challenges their narrow view of the world. His blue eyes held her steadily. What I don't understand is why you stay. The question struck Tamara with unexpected force. Why did she stay? The answer had seemed so obvious. She had nowhere else to go, no money, no family. But was that the only reason? It's my home, she said finally, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. A home where people spit on you in the street, Brody challenged gently. Where women whisper behind your back and men like Ed Simmons think they have the right to put their hands on you. Tamara looked away, unable to hold his gaze. What choice do I have? There are always choices, Tamara. Brody's voice softened. Sometimes we just need to be brave enough to see them. Before she could respond, a commotion from down the street caught their attention. A group of riders was approaching at a gallop, dust billowing behind them. As they drew closer, Tamara recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Mills, his face grim beneath his hat. The riders reined in sharply in front of them, their horses blowing and stamping after the hard run. Vance, Sheriff Mills called, dismounting with a grunt. Got word from the Triple R. There's been trouble. Brody tensed beside Tamara. What kind of trouble? Rustlers hit the north pasture, ran off with about 20 head of prime stock. Mills wiped sweat from his forehead with a bandana. Richardson's calling in all hands, sent me to fetch you and your boys. Brody nodded, his expression turning serious. My men at the saloon already rounded them up. They're getting the horses ready now. Mills's gaze slid to Tamara, his expression souring. Still keeping company with her, I see. Her name is Miss Owens, Brody replied, his tone flat. And yes, I value her company greatly, Mills snorted. Your business, I suppose, but Richardson won't take kindly to one of his men cozying up to I'd be careful about your next words, Sheriff, Brody interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. Very careful. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only by the restless movements of the horses. Finally, Mills shrugged. Like I said, your business, but you're needed at the Triple R now. I'll be there. Brody turned to Tamara, his expression softening. I have to go. Of course, she replied, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Be careful. Brody hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pressed something into her hand, the package of hard candies he'd purchased at the mercantile. Something sweet, he said quietly. For when things seem bitter. The simple gesture touched Tamara deeply. Thank you. I'll be back as soon as I can, Brody promised, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer before he turned to join the sheriff. Wait for me, he added, the question soft enough that only she could hear. I will, Tamara replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. As she watched Brody stride away, his tall figure soon lost among the group of mounted men galloping out of town, Tamara clutched the small package of candies like a talisman. For the first time in months, she had something to look forward to, something to wait for beyond the next day's drudgery. And that, she realized with a start, was a dangerous kind of hope. 3 days passed with no word from Brody. Tamara tried to focus on her duties at the boarding house, but her thoughts constantly drifted to him, wondering if he was safe, if he would truly return as he'd promised. Mrs. Fletcher noticed her distraction, commenting on it with increasing sharpness as Tamara's mistakes mounted a burned batch of biscuits, linens hung improperly, a chamber pot overturned while cleaning. That cowboy's got your head turned around, Mrs. Fletcher observed on the afternoon of the third day, watching Tamara absent-mindedly sweep the same corner of the parlor for the third time. Mark my words, girl, men like that don't settle. They move on when the wind changes. He's not like that, Tamara defended, though in truth, what did she really know about Brody Vance beyond a few encounters and his willingness to stand up for her? Mrs. Fletcher sighed, her expression softening slightly. I don't say this to be cruel, Tamara. I've seen it before. A handsome man shows a bit of kindness, and a young woman starts building castles in the air. She smoothed her apron with work-worn hands. I don't want to see you hurt again. You've had more than your share of suffering already. Tamara recognized the genuine concern beneath Mrs. Fletcher's brusque manner. The older woman had her faults, her fear of the town's judgment chief among them, but she'd shown Tamara more kindness than most. I appreciate your concern, Tamara said carefully, but I'm not building castles, I'm just… She struggled to articulate the feeling that had been growing inside her. I'm just allowing myself to hope again, just a little. Mrs. Fletcher looked as if she might say more, but the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Tamara moved to the window, her heart quickening at the sight of riders coming down the main street. As they drew closer, she recognized Brody at their lead, his hat pulled low, his clothes dusty from the trail. They're back, she whispered, more to herself than to Mrs. Fletcher. The older woman joined her at the window, observing the returning men with a critical eye. They look like they've had rough going, she noted. Probably be wanting hot baths and plenty of food. As if suddenly remembering herself, Tamara stepped back from the window. I'll put water on to heat and prepare extra food for supper. Mrs. Fletcher nodded, but caught Tamara's arm gently as she turned to go. Be careful with your heart, Tamara, that's all I ask. Tamara nodded, touched by the concern. I will. The next hours passed in a flurry of activity as the boarding house prepared for the returning cowboys. Tamara worked alongside Mrs. Fletcher and Betsy, the girl who came in to help with larger tasks, hauling water for baths, preparing a hearty stew with dumplings, and baking fresh bread. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the nervous energy that had been building inside her since she'd spotted the riders. It was nearly supper time when the men finally arrived at the boarding house, their voices and the heavy tread of their boots filling the previously quiet space. Tamara remained in the kitchen, stirring the stew with more attention than it required, listening for one voice in particular. Something smells mighty fine, Mrs. Fletcher, came Brody's voice from the dining room, and Tamara's spoon stilled momentarily. Just a simple stew and dumplings, Mr. Vance, Mrs. Fletcher replied. Figured you boys would be hungry after your troubles. Simple or not, it's a sight better than trail cooking, another man, one of Brody's companions, added appreciatively. Especially Jake's cooking. Man could burn water if you let him. Laughter followed, the sound of men relieved to be back in civilization after days of hard riding and likely dangerous work. Tamara resumed her stirring, wondering if Brody would seek her out or if he'd already forgotten his promise in the face of whatever challenges he'd encountered at the Triple R. Her question was answered moments later when the kitchen door swung open, and Brody stood framed in the doorway. He looked tired, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw and a small cut above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there when he left, but his eyes brightened when they landed on Tamara. You're still here, he said simply. Tamara nodded, suddenly shy under his direct gaze. I said I would be. Mrs. Fletcher bustled in behind him, her expression resigned when she saw them together. Mr. Vance, the dining room is through there. Tamara has work to finish in here. Brody didn't move from the doorway. I was hoping to speak with Miss Owens privately, Mrs. Fletcher. After supper, perhaps, the older woman's lips thinned. Tamara has evening chores, Mr. Vance, and a lady's reputation is already in tatters according to this town, Brody interrupted, though his tone remained respectful. I mean her no dishonor, Mrs. Fletcher. I simply wish to speak with her." Mrs. Fletcher looked between them, noting the way they stood, Brody still in the doorway, Tamara by the stove, a respectable distance between them but a connection that was almost palpable nonetheless. "Half an hour," she finally said. "On the back porch, where I can see you from the kitchen window, after the supper dishes are cleared." "Thank you," Brody said, genuine gratitude in his voice. To Tamara, he added more softly, "I'll see you then," before retreating to join his companions in the dining room. The meal seemed to stretch endlessly, as Tamara and Mrs. Fletcher served the hungry men. Tamara was acutely aware of Brody's presence throughout, though he made no special effort to engage her, maintaining a respectful distance that she suspected was for her benefit as much as for propriety's sake. Finally, the meal concluded, the dishes were cleared and washed, and Mrs. Fletcher gave Tamara a small nod, releasing her from her duties. Heart pounding, Tamara dried her hands on her apron, smoothed her hair as best she could, and made her way to the back porch. Brody was already waiting, leaning against the porch railing, looking out at the darkening yard. He straightened when he heard her approach, removing his hat. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his deep voice carrying in the quiet evening air. "Of course." Tamara remained near the door, her hands clasped before her. "Was there trouble at the Triple R?" Brody nodded, his expression turning serious. "The rustlers took more than just cattle. They killed 2 of Richardson's men who tried to stop them. We tracked them into the mountains, had a shootout." His hand rose unconsciously to the cut above his eyebrow. "Got the cattle back, but 3 of the rustlers got away." "I'm glad you're safe," Tamara said, genuine relief in her voice, when days passed with no word. "I wanted to send a message, but we were deep in Apache territory. Couldn't risk a rider alone." His eyes held her steadily. "But I thought of you, every day." The simple admission sent warmth spreading through Tamara's chest. "I thought of you too," she confessed quietly. Brody moved closer, still keeping a respectable distance, but near enough that Tamara could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. "I meant what I said before I left, Tamara, about choices, about not staying somewhere you're not valued." Tamara sighed, leaning against the porch post. "It's not that simple, Brody. I have no money, no family, nowhere to go." "What if you did?" he asked. "Have somewhere to go, I mean." Tamara looked at him questioningly, uncertain of his meaning. Brody took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "Richardson was impressed with how we handled the rustlers. He's offered me a permanent position, foreman of the Triple R, with my own cabin on the property." "That's wonderful," Tamara said sincerely, though her heart sank at the implication that Brody would be staying in the area but not in town. The Triple R was a half-day's ride away, far enough to make casual visits impossible. "It comes with good pay, respect," Brody continued. "A chance to build something." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I won't take it if you won't come with me." Tamara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "I'm asking you to come with me, Tamara, as my wife." The word hung in the air between them, impossible and wondrous all at once. Tamara's mind raced, unable to fully comprehend what Brody was proposing. "Your wife." She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Brody, you barely know me." "I know enough," he replied with quiet certainty. "I know you're strong enough to survive what would have destroyed most people. I know you faced cruelty and judgment with more dignity than this entire town deserves. I know that when I look at you, I see someone I want to build a life with." Tamara shook her head, overwhelmed. "You can't mean that. What would people say? What would Richardson say when he learns who I am, what people think of me?" "Richardson doesn't strike me as a man who cares much for gossip," Brody replied. "And even if he did, even if taking you as my wife cost me the position, I'd still ask you the same question." He stepped closer, close enough now that Tamara could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I've spent my life moving from place to place, never putting down roots. But something changed when I met you, Tamara. For the first time, I can see a future I want to be part of." Tears pricked at Tamara's eyes. The sincerity in Brody's voice was unmistakable, but the enormity of what he was proposing, a complete upheaval of both their lives, was almost too much to comprehend. "This is madness," she whispered. "People will talk. They'll say you married damaged goods, that I bewitched you somehow." "Let them talk," Brody said firmly. "Their words can't touch us unless we let them." You say that now, but I say it because I know it's true. Brody reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, Tamara. I know this is sudden. I know you need time. But I wanted you to know that there is a choice, a path out of this town, a chance for something better. The tenderness in his touch undid her completely. A sob escaped Tamara's throat as months of pent-up emotion, grief, fear, loneliness, and now this unexpected hope came rushing to the surface. Without thinking, she stepped into Brody's arms, burying her face against his chest. His arms came around her, strong and secure, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other pressed against her back, holding her close but not confining her. It was the first genuine human contact Tamara had experienced since her return to town, and the simple comfort of it was overwhelming. "It's all right," Brody murmured against her hair. "It's all right." They stood like that for several moments, Tamara's tears gradually subsiding as Brody held her, his presence solid and reassuring. When she finally pulled back slightly, embarrassed by her breakdown, Brody didn't release her entirely, his hands coming to rest lightly on her upper arms. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping at her damp cheeks. "I don't usually." "Don't apologize for feeling, Tamara," Brody said gently. "Not with me." The kitchen door opened behind them, and Mrs. Fletcher's silhouette appeared in the doorway. "Time's up," she called, her voice firm but not unkind. Brody stepped back respectfully, though his eyes remained on Tamara. "Think about what I said," he told her quietly. "I'll be here for 2 more days before I need to give Richardson my answer. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Tamara nodded, unable to form words past the lump in her throat. As she turned to go back inside, Brody spoke once more. "Tamara," she looked back, her heart pounding. "You deserve happiness," he said simply. "Whether it's with me or not, don't forget that." That night, Tamara lay awake in her small attic room, Brody's proposal turning over and over in her mind. Marriage, a new beginning, a life away from the whispers and contempt of redemption springs. It seemed too good to be true, a fairy tale ending that couldn't possibly be meant for someone like her. And yet, Brody's sincerity had been unmistakable. There had been no pity in his eyes, only warmth and something that, if she dared to name it, might have been love. But was it possible to love someone after such a short acquaintance? Or was Brody simply offering marriage as a way to protect her? A noble but ultimately misguided gesture that they would both come to regret. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the small window of her room. Tamara rose from her bed and moved to look out at the night. The moon was nearly full, casting redemption springs in silver light that softened its harsh edges. From her high vantage point, she could see the entire town spread out before her, the place that had once been home but now felt like a prison. What was keeping her here? Fear, habit, a misplaced sense of loyalty to a community that had shown her nothing but scorn. Mrs. Fletcher's kindness was real, but it was tempered by the older woman's fear of social consequences. There was nothing else tying Tamara to this place except memories, many of them painful. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Tamara finally made her decision. She would accept Brody's proposal, not out of desperation or lack of options, but because she recognized in him something she'd thought lost forever: the possibility of joy. The next morning, Tamara rose early, dressing with particular care in her one good dress, a simple blue cotton that had once belonged to her mother. She brushed her hair until it shone, arranging it in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. There was color in her cheeks, a light in her eyes that had been absent for months. Mrs. Fletcher noticed the change immediately when Tamara entered the kitchen. "You look different this morning," she observed, her shrewd eyes taking in Tamara's appearance. "I feel different," Tamara admitted, reaching for her apron. "It's Vance, isn't it?" Mrs. Fletcher asked, her tone neutral. "He's turned your head completely." Rather than denying it, Tamara met the older woman's gaze directly. "He's asked me to marry him," she said simply. Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Marry, after knowing you less than a week?" Sometimes a week is enough, Tamara replied with a conviction that surprised her. Sometimes you just know. The older woman studied her for a long moment, then sighed deeply. Your mother would have cautioned you against such haste, she said, her voice softening. But then again, Sarah always did have a romantic streak beneath that practical exterior. The mention of her mother caught Tamara off guard. Mrs. Fletcher rarely spoke of Sarah Owens, though the two women had been friends before the Owens family moved to their homestead. You think she would have disapproved? Tamara asked, a small knot of uncertainty forming in her stomach. Mrs. Fletcher's expression turned thoughtful. I think she would have worried, as mothers do, but I also think she would have wanted you to find happiness wherever and however it came. She reached out, adjusting the collar of Tamara's dress with gentle hands. Your mother loved fiercely, Tamara. She would have understood recognizing that quality in another person. The knot in Tamara's stomach eased at these words. I'm going to say yes, she said, the declaration making her decision feel real and solid for the first time, Mrs. Fletcher nodded, her expression a complex mix of emotions: concern, resignation, and perhaps a touch of wistfulness. Then I wish you happiness, child, true happiness. Thank you, Tamara whispered, touched by the sincerity in the older woman's voice. The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, Tamara's mind elsewhere as she went through the motions of her daily chores. She hadn't seen Brody at breakfast. He and his men had left early for a final meeting at the Triple R, and she found herself counting the hours until his return. It was mid-afternoon when the riders returned to town. Tamara was in the garden behind the boarding house, gathering vegetables for the evening meal, when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats. Setting her basket aside, she moved to the edge of the garden where she could see the main street. Brody rode at the head of his small group, his posture straight and confident in the saddle. As they reached the center of town, however, something caught his attention. He reined in sharply, his companions following suit. From her position, Tamara couldn't see what had caused the sudden stop, but she could sense the tension that had rippled through the group of riders. Without thinking, she moved closer, making her way to the front of the boarding house for a better view. What she saw made her blood run cold. Sheriff Mills and a group of men, including Ed Simmons and his father, had formed a line across the street, effectively blocking Brody and his companions. Behind them, a crowd was gathering, faces Tamara recognized from town, expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. That's far enough, Vance, Sheriff Mills called, his hand resting ostentatiously on his holstered gun. Brody remained mounted, his posture relaxed despite the obvious confrontation brewing. Is there a problem, Sheriff? You could say that. Mills stepped forward, thumbs hooked in his belt. Got word from Fort Williams yesterday. Seems they're looking for a man fitting your description. A man who's wanted for questioning in connection with a stagecoach robbery near El Paso last year. 3 men dead. A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Tamara's heart hammered in her chest as she edged closer, trying to see Brody's expression. Is that right? Brody's voice betrayed no concern. And what name was this wanted man using? Willis. Brody Willis, Mills smirked. Sound familiar? Can't say it does, Brody replied evenly. My name is Brody Vance, has been all my life. A man can change his name easy enough, Ed Simmons called out, especially a man with something to hide. Brody's gaze shifted to Ed, and even from a distance, Tamara could see the dangerous glint in his eyes. Seems to me like a man making accusations ought to be certain of his facts first. The Army's sending a lieutenant who can identify this Willis character, Mills continued, should be here by tomorrow. Until then, I'm going to have to ask you and your men to surrender your weapons and come along to the jail. Just as a precaution, you understand. One of Brody's companions, a red-headed man Tamara had heard called Jake, shifted in his saddle. We ain't surrendering nothing, Sheriff. You got no proof, just rumors. It doesn't have to get complicated, boys, Mills said, his hand moving closer to his gun. Just come along peaceful-like, and if the lieutenant says you're not the men he's looking for, you'll be free to go. The tension in the air was palpable now, a powder keg ready to explode at the slightest spark. Tamara looked at the faces of the townspeople gathered around. Many were the same ones who had spat on her, who had whispered behind her back and called her terrible names. Now they were ready to condemn Brody on nothing more than rumor and suspicion. Without thinking about the consequences, Tamara stepped forward into the street, placing herself between Sheriff Mills and Brody. A gasp went up from the crowd. "This is wrong, Sheriff Mills, and you know it," she called, her voice stronger than she'd thought possible. "You have no proof against Mr. Vance, just coincidence and hearsay." "Get out of the way, Tamara," Mills ordered, his face darkening. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns everyone who believes in justice," Tamara replied, standing her ground. "You're ready to jail a man based on nothing but rumor the same way this town condemned me without ever hearing my side of the story." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some agreeing, others objecting to the comparison. "This is different," Ed Simmons shouted. "Vance is a killer." "And what am I, Ed?" Tamara challenged, turning to face the crowd directly. "What names have you called me? What crimes have you accused me of without evidence? You spat on me for surviving something terrible. You made judgments without knowing the truth, and now you're doing the same to him." "Tamara," Brody's voice came from behind her, gentle but firm, "this isn't your fight." She turned to look up at him, still mounted on his horse. "Yes, it is," she said clearly, "because I love you." The words, spoken for the first time and in front of the entire town, fell into a sudden silence. Brody's expression softened, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "I love you too," he replied, his voice carrying in the quiet street, "which is why I can't let you put yourself in danger for me." He dismounted in one fluid motion, coming to stand beside Tamara. To Sheriff Mills he said, "I'll come with you peacefully, Sheriff, but my men stay free. They've done nothing wrong." "Brody, no," Tamara protested, gripping his arm. "You haven't done anything wrong either." "Trust me," he murmured, covering her hand with his own. "This will all be sorted out tomorrow when the lieutenant arrives." Mills looked relieved at Brody's cooperation. "Your men can keep their guns, but they'd best behave themselves while you're my guest." Brody nodded to his companions, a silent command to stand down. The tension in the air eased slightly as the confrontation shifted from potential violence to reluctant cooperation. "I'll expect fair treatment, Sheriff," Brody said as he unbuckled his gunbelt and handed it to Jake. "And I'll be holding you to your word about releasing me if this lieutenant clears things up." "You'll get no trouble from me if you're innocent," Mills replied, though his tone suggested he'd already made up his mind about Brody's guilt. As two of the sheriff's deputies moved forward to escort Brody to the jail, he turned to Tamara one last time. "Remember what I asked you," he said quietly. "My offer stands, whatever happens tomorrow." Tamara nodded, her throat too tight for words. She watched as Brody was led away, his head held high, his steps steady. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people shot contemptuous looks in Tamara's direction. Her public defense of Brody had only confirmed what many already believed, that she was an outcast, unworthy of their community. But for the first time since her return to Redemption Springs, the judgment didn't cut as deeply. Because for the first time, she had something the town couldn't take away from her love, and the promise of a future beyond their narrow boundaries. As she turned to head back to the boarding house, Tamara caught sight of Mrs. Fletcher watching from the porch, her expression unreadable. There would be consequences for her public stand, Tamara knew. But whatever came next, she would face it with newfound strength, the strength that came from knowing she was no longer alone. Night fell over Redemption Springs, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. Tamara paced her small attic room, unable to settle. Brody was in the town jail, accused of a crime she was certain he hadn't committed, and she felt powerless to help him. Mrs. Fletcher had been surprisingly understanding when Tamara returned to the boarding house after the confrontation in the street. Rather than the lecture Tamara had expected, the older woman had simply handed her a cup of tea and said, "Sometimes standing up for what's right comes at a cost. Your mother would have been proud of your courage today." Now, as the church bell tolled 10 o'clock, Tamara made a decision. She couldn't sit by and do nothing while Brody's fate hung in the balance. At the very least, she needed to see him to assure herself that he was being treated fairly. Changing into her sturdier day dress and pulling a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill, Tamara made her way quietly down the attic stairs. The boarding house was dark and silent, its occupants long since retired for the night. She slipped out the kitchen door and into the alleyway behind the building. The moon was bright enough to light her way as she moved through the sleeping town toward the small jailhouse at the end of the main street. A single lamp burned in the window of the jail, casting a yellow glow onto the boardwalk outside. Tamara approached cautiously, unsure of her reception. Through the window, she could see Deputy Wilson slumped in a chair, his hat pulled low over his eyes, apparently dozing at his post. There was no sign of Sheriff Mills. Gathering her courage, Tamara climbed the steps and pushed open the door. The hinges creaked, causing Deputy Wilson to jerk awake, his hand automatically going to his gun. "Miss Owens," he exclaimed, relaxing slightly when he recognized her. "What in tarnation are you doing here at this hour?" "I'd like to see Mr. Vance, if I may," Tamara said, trying to keep her voice steady. Wilson frowned, scratching his stubbled chin. "Sheriff wouldn't like that much. Prisoners ain't supposed to have visitors after dark." "Please," Tamara said, moving closer to the deputy's desk. "Just for a few minutes, I need to know he's all right." Wilson hesitated, clearly torn. Unlike some in town, he had never been openly hostile to Tamara, though he'd done nothing to defend her either. "Sheriff's over at the saloon," he said finally. "Probably be there another hour at least." Hope flared in Tamara's chest. "Does that mean?" With a sigh, Wilson stood up, retrieving a ring of keys from a hook on the wall. 5 minutes, he said firmly. "And if Mills comes back early, I'll deny I ever let you in." "Thank you," Tamara said sincerely. "I won't forget your kindness." Wilson led her to the back of the jailhouse where 3 small cells were arranged in a row. Only one was occupied. Brody sat on the narrow cot, his back against the wall, his hat resting on his knee. He straightened immediately when he saw Tamara. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though his eyes told a different story, one of happiness at seeing her despite the circumstances. "I had to come," Tamara replied as Wilson unlocked the cell door. 5 minutes, the deputy reminded her, swinging the door open. "I'll be up front. Don't try anything funny, Vance." "Wouldn't dream of it," Brody replied, his eyes never leaving Tamara's face. When Wilson had retreated to the front of the jailhouse, Tamara stepped into the cell. It was small and sparse, just the cot, a small table, and a bucket in the corner. The smell of old sweat and despair hung in the air. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes scanning Brody for any signs of mistreatment. "I'm fine," he assured her. "Mills is being careful. He knows Richardson would raise hell if anything happened to me before this supposed lieutenant arrives." He moved closer, his expression turning serious. "But you shouldn't have come, Tamara. It's not safe for you to be out alone at night." "I had to see you," she said simply. "I couldn't bear the thought of you in here because of some ridiculous mistake." Brody's expression softened. "It'll be cleared up tomorrow. This lieutenant, if he even exists, won't recognize me because I'm not Brody Willis. I've never been to El Paso, and I've certainly never robbed a stagecoach." "Then why is Sheriff Mills so convinced you're this outlaw?" Tamara asked, troubled by the conviction in Mills's accusations. Brody sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mills doesn't like outsiders coming in and upsetting his version of order, and I embarrassed him by standing up for you publicly. This is as much about putting me in my place as it is about any genuine suspicion." The truth of his words rang clear. Sheriff Mills had always been more concerned with maintaining his authority than with actual justice. His treatment of Tamara after her return had made that abundantly clear. "What if this lieutenant claims you're Willis anyway?" Tamara asked, voicing the fear that had been nagging at her all evening. "What if Mills has already decided your guilt and is just looking for an excuse?" Brody reached out, taking her hands in his. "Then we'll face it together," he said firmly. "Richardson won't stand for one of his men being falsely accused. He has influence in the territory." Tamara squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his confidence. "When this is over," she said, "I want to accept your proposal. I want to be your wife, Brody." The joy that transformed Brody's features was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You mean that?" "With all my heart," Tamara replied, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I've never been more certain of anything." Brody drew her closer, one hand rising to cup her cheek. "Then nothing else matters," he said softly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together, and then we'll leave this town behind and start our life, our real life." Their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and fierce, a promise, a commitment, a declaration of faith in each other and the future they would build. For Tamara, who had known nothing but pain and rejection for months, the tenderness of Brody's touch was a revelation, a healing balm to her wounded spirit. When they finally parted, Brody pressed his forehead against hers. "I've thought about doing that since the moment I first saw you," he confessed, his voice husky. "Even knowing what the town thought of me?" Tamara asked, still barely able to believe that this man, this good, brave man, had chosen her. "Especially knowing what the town thought," Brody replied, a trace of anger entering his voice. "Because I could see what they couldn't or wouldn't. I could see your strength, your dignity in the face of their cruelty. How could I not fall in love with that?" The sound of boots on the wooden floor alerted them to Wilson's return. "Time's up," the deputy called, his voice apologetic but firm. Brody pressed one more quick kiss to Tamara's lips before releasing her. "Go back to Mrs. Fletcher's," he urged quietly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, one way or another, this will be resolved." Tamara nodded, reluctantly stepping back as Wilson approached to lock the cell door. "I'll be there when the lieutenant arrives," she promised. "You won't face this alone." As Wilson escorted her back to the front of the jailhouse, Tamara felt a curious sense of peace settle over her. Despite the uncertainty ahead, she had made her choice. She had found love in the most unexpected place in the midst of judgment and cruelty. A light had emerged that would guide her out of darkness. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would meet it with courage and hope the two gifts Brody had returned to her when she needed them most. The dawn broke with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, the sky a perfect azure unmarred by clouds. Tamara had slept little, her mind too full of worries and hopes to find proper rest. She rose early, dressing with particular care in her blue dress, the same one she had worn when she told Brody she loved him in front of the entire town. Mrs. Fletcher found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with mechanical efficiency despite her distracted thoughts. "The lieutenant is expected on the morning stage," the older woman informed her, tying her apron strings with practiced movements. "The whole town's talking about it." "Of course they are," Tamara replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Nothing like a potential hanging to bring everyone together." Mrs. Fletcher gave her a sharp look. "That's not how it will go, Tamara. Richardson sent word that he's riding in from the RRR this morning with his lawyer. He doesn't believe these accusations against Mr. Vance any more than you do." This news lifted some of the weight from Tamara's shoulders. Thomas Richardson was one of the most powerful men in the territory. If he was standing behind Brody, that significantly improved the odds of a fair hearing. "Thank you for telling me," Tamara said, managing a small smile for Mrs. Fletcher. "And thank you for not condemning my decision about Brody." Mrs. Fletcher sighed, her expression softening. "Love finds us in strange ways sometimes," she said, a hint of something like wistfulness in her voice. "I learned long ago not to question its timing or its wisdom. If Vance makes you happy, truly happy, then that's all that matters." The morning passed in a haze of routine tasks, the hands of the clock seeming to move with deliberate slowness as Tamara waited for the arrival of the stage. Around 11 o'clock, a commotion in the street drew her to the window. The stagecoach had arrived, dust billowing around the team of horses as they came to a stop in front of the town's small hotel. A crowd had already gathered, news of the lieutenant's arrival having spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire. "Go on," Mrs. Fletcher said from behind her. "I can manage here." Grateful, Tamara removed her apron and hurried out into the street. The crowd parted reluctantly as she approached, whispers following in her wake. She ignored them, focusing on the stagecoach where passengers were beginning to disembark. The first to emerge was a woman in a fashionable traveling suit, her face obscured by a small veiled hat. She was followed by an elderly gentleman who needed assistance from the driver to navigate the steep step down. Finally, a man in the unmistakable blue uniform of a cavalry officer stepped down from the coach, his posture erect, his manner crisp and authoritative. Lieutenant Joshua Taylor, as he soon identified himself to Sheriff Mills who had come forward to greet him, was younger than Tamara had expected, perhaps 30, with a neatly trimmed mustache and intelligent eyes. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. "I understand you have a prisoner you believe to be Brody Willis," the lieutenant was saying to Mills as Tamara edged closer. "I'll need to see him immediately." "Of course, Lieutenant," Mills replied, puffing up with self-importance. "Right this way. We've been holding him secure since yesterday." As the two men turned toward the jail, another commotion drew the crowd's attention. A group of riders was approaching from the north end of town Thomas Richardson, and several of his men, including Jake and the other cowboys who had accompanied Brody to town. Richardson was a formidable figure even in his 60s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shock of white hair and a meticulously groomed beard. He dismounted with the ease of a man half his age, his piercing gaze sweeping the gathered crowd until it landed on Lieutenant Taylor. "Lieutenant," he called, striding forward with purpose. "I believe you're here about one of my men." Taylor turned, recognition dawning on his face. "Mr. Richardson, I didn't expect to see you here." "I make it a point to be present when one of my employees is falsely accused," Richardson replied, his tone making it clear he considered the charges against Brody to be exactly that. Particularly one as valuable as Brody Vance. Mills shifted uncomfortably, caught between the authority of the lieutenant and the influence of the territory's wealthiest rancher. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion at the jail, gentlemen," he suggested. "Away from prying ears." Richardson nodded curtly. "Lead the way, Sheriff. But be aware that my lawyer will be arriving on the afternoon stage. I expect no action to be taken against Mr. Vance until he's present." The group moved toward the jail, the crowd following at a respectful distance, eager to witness the unfolding drama. Tamara hesitated only briefly before joining the procession. Whatever happened next, she needed to be there for Brody. The jail was too small to accommodate everyone, so only Richardson, Lieutenant Taylor, Sheriff Mills, and the mayor, who had arrived breathless and disheveled, clearly having been summoned in haste, were allowed inside. The rest of the town, Tamara included, gathered in the street outside, speculating in hushed voices about what might be occurring within. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the waiting crowd, but few people drifted away. The potential identification of Brody Vance as a wanted outlaw was too enticing a spectacle to miss. Finally, just as the church bell tolled 1 o'clock, the jail door opened. Sheriff Mills emerged first, his expression unreadable. He was followed by the mayor, who looked distinctly uncomfortable, and then Lieutenant Taylor and Richardson, deep in conversation. Last came Brody himself, unbound and walking freely. A murmur ran through the crowd, growing louder as it became clear that Brody was not being treated as a prisoner. Tamara pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Sheriff Mills raised his hands, calling for quiet. "Folks, I have an announcement to make," he declared, his voice carrying across the gathered townspeople. "After a thorough examination and questioning by Lieutenant Taylor, it has been determined that Mr. Vance is not, in fact, the wanted man known as Brody Willis." Relief flooded through Tamara, so intense that she felt momentarily light-headed. Brody's eyes found hers in the crowd, a smile lifting the corner of his mouth as he gave her a small nod of reassurance. "Furthermore," Mills continued, clearly unhappy with what he was about to say, "it appears that the information we received regarding Mr. Willis was incomplete. Lieutenant Taylor has informed us that Willis was captured near Santa Fe 2 months ago and is currently awaiting trial in a territorial prison." Voices rose from the crowd, some expressing relief, others disappointment that the excitement had come to such an anticlimactic end. A few, Tamara noted, looked genuinely chagrined at having so quickly believed the worst about Brody. "In light of this information," Mills concluded stiffly, "Mr. Vance is free to go, with the full apologies of my office for any inconvenience." The formal words couldn't disguise the sheriff's reluctance or his embarrassment at having been proven wrong so publicly. Beside him, Richardson looked grimly satisfied, while Lieutenant Taylor maintained the neutral expression of a man who had simply done his duty. Brody stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "I appreciate the sheriff's thoroughness in investigating these claims," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "And I bear no ill will toward those who were simply concerned for the safety of their town." His graciousness in victory only emphasized how poorly he had been treated, a fact not lost on many in the crowd. Several people looked away, unable to meet his direct gaze. "However," Brody continued, his tone hardening slightly, "I would hope that in the future, this town might extend the same consideration to all of its citizens, the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. A community is only as strong as its commitment to justice for all." His eyes found Tamara again, and this time the message in them was unmistakable. He was speaking not just of himself, but of her, of how she had been judged and condemned without evidence or compassion. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, many people suddenly finding great interest in their boots or the condition of their fingernails. The parallel Brody had drawn was too clear to ignore, forcing them to confront their own hypocrisy. As the gathering began to disperse, Brody made his way directly to Tamara, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. When he reached her, he took her hands in his eyes searching her face. "It's over," he said simply. "They know you're innocent now," Tamara replied, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "They do." Brody's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "Richardson has asked me to return to the R with him today to finalize arrangements for the foreman position." His eyes held hers intently. "I told him I wouldn't be coming alone." Tamara's heart quickened. "You told him about us," Brody nodded. "Everything. Your ordeal with the Apache, how the town treated you upon your return, our plans to marry. He's a good man, Tamara. He understands more than you might expect. And he's still offering you the position, even knowing about me." Tamara couldn't quite believe that anyone with Richardson's influence would risk association with her, given the town's attitude. He said, and I quote, "Any woman who survived what she did and still has the courage to stand up to an entire town is exactly the kind of person I want at the R." Brody's expression softened. "He's offered us the use of the old foreman's cabin. It needs some work, but it's a good, solid place. Room enough for a family when the time comes." A family. The word resonated within Tamara like a bell, calling forth dreams she had thought forever lost. A home, children, love. The future stretching out before her, full of possibility rather than dread. "When do we leave?" she asked, her decision made. "As soon as you're ready," Brody replied. "Richardson's men are waiting. We can be at the R by nightfall." Tamara glanced back at the boarding house where she had spent the last months of her life, a refuge of sorts, but never truly a home. "I don't have much to pack," she said. "Just a few clothes, some keepsakes from my parents. That's all we need," Brody assured her. "Everything else, we'll build together." As they walked toward the boarding house, hand in hand and heedless of the stares that followed them, Tamara felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the burden of judgment and shame she had carried for so long, growing lighter with each step toward her new life. Mrs. Fletcher was waiting on the porch, her expression a mix of happiness and wistful sadness. "I heard the news," she said as they approached. "Both pieces that Mr. Vance has been cleared and that you'll be leaving with him." "Yes," Tamara confirmed, squeezing Brody's hand. "Today, if you don't mind me gathering my things so quickly." "I've already started packing them for you," Mrs. Fletcher admitted, surprising them both. "I knew which way the wind was blowing as soon as I saw you two together." She stepped forward, taking Tamara's free hand in both of hers. "I'll miss you, child. This house won't be the same without you." Touched by the genuine affection in the older woman's voice, Tamara impulsively embraced her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for taking me in when no one else would, Mrs." Fletcher returned the embrace briefly before stepping back, her composure reasserted. "Well," she said briskly, "best get your things together. Wouldn't want to keep Mr. Richardson waiting." An hour later, Tamara's meager possessions were packed in a single trunk and secured to one of Richardson's wagons. She had changed into her traveling clothes, a simple skirt and blouse, sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun. Around her neck hung her mother's locket, containing tiny portraits of her parents on their wedding day, the only physical remnant of her family she had managed to recover after the raid. Brody helped her up onto the wagon's seat, his hand lingering on hers longer than strictly necessary. "Ready?" he asked softly. Tamara looked back at Redemption Springs, the town that had once been her home, then her prison, and now merely a place she was passing through on the way to something better. A few townspeople had gathered to watch their departure, their expressions ranging from hostile to indifferent to, in a few cases, genuinely remorseful. Among them stood Ed Simmons, his face dark with anger. Their eyes met briefly, and Tamara felt a momentary chill at the hatred she saw there. But then Brody was beside her, his solid presence a shield against such malice, and the feeling passed. "I'm ready," she said, turning away from the town and toward the open road ahead. "More than ready." Richardson gave the signal, and the small procession began to move the wagon carrying Tamara and Brody, followed by Richardson and his men on horseback. As they passed the town limits, Tamara felt something inside her release a breath she hadn't known she was holding, a tension so constant she had ceased to recognize it, until it was gone. Beside her, Brody sensed the change. "All right," he asked quietly. Tamara smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that felt foreign on her face after so many months of careful control. "Yes," she replied, her voice stronger than it had been in longer than she could remember. "I think I finally am." The road to the Triple R wound through rolling hills and across a wide plateau, the landscape growing more rugged and beautiful as they traveled north. Tamara drank in the sights, the distant mountains, the vast expanse of sky, the occasional glimpse of wildlife. It had been months since she'd ventured beyond the confines of Redemption Springs, and the sense of freedom was intoxicating. As the afternoon waned toward evening, Richardson rode up alongside their wagon. "We'll be coming up on the ranch soon," he informed them. "Thought you might like to see it from the high ridge first. Best view of the whole spread." He led them off the main trail to a small rise that overlooked a vast valley below. There, nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains, lay the Triple R, a sprawling collection of buildings surrounding a large main house, with corrals, barns, and bunkhouses arranged in neat order. Beyond stretched acres of grazing land where cattle moved like dark specks against the green gold of summer grass. "It's beautiful," Tamara breathed, taking in the sight. "Prettiest ranch in the territory," Richardson agreed with undisguised pride. "Built it up from nothing over 40 years. He turned to Brody. "Your cabin is just beyond that stand of cottonwoods to the east of the main house. Good location, close enough to be convenient, far enough for privacy." Brody nodded his thanks. "It's an honor to be entrusted with helping run such an operation, sir." Richardson waved away the formality. "You earned it with how you handled those rustlers, and something tells me having Mrs. Vance at your side will make you even more effective." His keen eyes moved to Tamara. "Strong women make for strong partnerships." My Eliza, God rest her soul, was the backbone of this place for 30 years before the fever took her. The mention of a wife suggested a depth to Richardson that Tamara hadn't expected. Perhaps he truly did understand something of loss and resilience. As they descended into the valley and approached the ranch proper, Tamara felt a curious mix of nervousness and anticipation. This would be her home now, a place where no one knew her as the Apache captive or whispered behind her back. Here, she would be Mrs. Vance, the foreman's wife. A fresh start in every sense. The ranch hands emerged from various buildings as they arrived, curious about the new foreman and his soon-to-be bride. Tamara was struck by the diversity of the group, not just white men, but several Mexican vaqueros, an older black man who seemed to hold a position of authority, and even a young Apache man dressed in ranch clothes rather than traditional garb. Richardson made brief introductions as they dismounted. "This is Brody Vance, your new foreman," he announced, "and Miss Tamara Owens, soon to be Mrs. Vance. They'll be taking over the old foreman's cabin starting today." There were nods of greeting, a few tips of hats and curious glances, but none of the barely disguised contempt Tamara had grown accustomed to in town. It was, she realized, the first time in months she'd been introduced to strangers without her past hanging over the interaction like a dark cloud. "Manuel will show you to your cabin," Richardson said, indicating one of the vaqueros. "Get settled in tonight. Work starts at dawn, Vance, but I expect you know that already." "Yes, sir," Brody confirmed. "We'll be ready." As Manuel led them toward a path that wound through the cottonwoods, Tamara felt Brody's hand come to rest lightly at the small of her back, a gesture both protective and possessive that she found she didn't mind in the slightest. "You doing all right?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching her face for signs of fatigue or distress. "Better than all right," Tamara assured him. "It feels peaceful here." The cabin, when they reached it, was larger than Tamara had expected, a solid structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch running the length of the front. It stood in a small clearing, surrounded by cottonwoods that offered shade and privacy. "Not been used since old foreman left last winter," Manuel explained as he unlocked the door. "Mr. Richardson had it cleaned 2 days ago when he decided to hire Mr. Vance. Is basic but good, yes. Water from well behind cabin. Stove works good for cooking and heat." The interior was simple, but welcoming: a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, a bedroom visible through an open doorway, and what appeared to be a smaller second bedroom or storage room. The furniture was plain but sturdy: a table with chairs, a sofa before the fireplace, shelves built into the walls. "It's perfect," Tamara said, meaning it. After her tiny attic room at the boarding house, the cabin seemed positively spacious. Manuel nodded, pleased by her reaction. "I bring your trunk," he said, heading back outside. Left alone for the first time since leaving Redemption Springs, Tamara and Brody stood in the center of what would be their home, a moment of realization passing between them. "We made it," Brody said softly, taking her hands in his. "A new beginning." "It still doesn't seem quite real," Tamara admitted. "All of this happening so quickly." "Too quickly?" Brody asked, a hint of uncertainty crossing his features for the first time since she'd known him. Tamara shook her head, squeezing his hands reassuringly. "No, just unexpected. A week ago I couldn't imagine a future beyond the next day, and now we have a lifetime ahead of us," Brody finished, drawing her closer. "Together." Manuel's return with the trunk prevented any further conversation, but the look that passed between them held promises that needed no words. That evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Tamara sat on the porch of their cabin, watching as the sky painted itself in shades of crimson and gold. Brody joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and settled beside her on the rough-hewn bench. "Tomorrow we'll ride into the nearest town, Pleasant Valley, and find someone to marry us," he said, passing her one of the cups. "It's smaller than Redemption Springs but more welcoming, from what Richardson tells me. They have a proper church and a minister." Tamara nodded, warming her hands on the hot cup. "I'd like that, to make it official before." She blushed slightly, not finishing the thought. Brody smiled, understanding her meaning. Despite the connection between them, they had both silently agreed to wait until they were properly married before sharing the bedroom now prepared with fresh linens courtesy of the ranch cook's wife. "Richardson says we can take a few days after the wedding," Brody continued. "Sort of a honeymoon, though we won't be going far. Just time to settle in together before I need to fully take up the foreman duties." "That sounds wonderful," Tamara replied, leaning slightly against his solid warmth. "I can't remember the last time I had days with nothing to do but please myself." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging in the vast canopy of the sky. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their cries carrying across the open land. "The first night after I escaped from the Apache," Tamara said suddenly, the memory surfacing unexpectedly, "I heard coyotes like this. I was hiding in a small arroyo, certain they would find me and tear me to pieces, but instead their howling was comforting somehow. A reminder that the world was still turning, that nature continued its cycles regardless of human suffering." Brody's arm came around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "You never really told me how you escaped," he said gently. "Only that there was a skirmish with soldiers." Tamara took a deep breath, realizing that she wanted to share this story with Brody not because she needed to explain or justify herself, but because she wanted him to know all of her, even the painful parts. "It was early morning," she began, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the memories. "The camp was just waking up. I had been with them for 3 months by then, and they had grown more relaxed about watching me. I still wasn't allowed weapons or a horse, but I could move around the camp freely, gathering wood or water." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee before continuing. "The soldiers came without warning. A patrol from Fort Williams that had been tracking the band for several days, according to what I learned later. There was gunfire, confusion. In the chaos, I saw my chance. I just ran as fast and as far as I could." Brody remained silent, giving her the space to tell her story at her own pace. "I had learned enough from the Apache to survive in the wild how to find water, which plants were safe to eat. I walked for 2 days, mostly at night to avoid the worst of the heat. When the hunting party from Redemption Springs found me, I was half dead from exhaustion and exposure." "You showed incredible courage," Brody said, his voice low and fervent. "Not just in escaping, but in surviving afterward, both in the wilderness and in that town." Tamara shook her head slightly. "I don't know if it was courage so much as stubbornness. I simply refused to let everything that had happened be for nothing. My parents, my brother, their deaths would have no meaning if I simply gave up and died too." Brody turned to face her fully, his expression solemn in the starlight. "That's exactly what courage is, Tamara. Not fearlessness, but continuing on despite fear, finding meaning in tragedy, refusing to let the darkness win." His words touched something deep within her, a recognition of the strength she had found in herself but had never fully acknowledged. She had survived, yes. But more than that, she had preserved her essential self, her capacity for kindness, for hope, for love despite everything that had tried to break her. "I love you," she said simply, the words coming easily now. "Not just for defending me or offering me a way out, but for seeing me, truly seeing me when everyone else looked away." Brody set his coffee cup aside and took hers, placing it next to his on the porch railing. Then he gathered her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "Tamara Owens," he said, his voice rich with emotion, "when I rode into Redemption Springs, I was a man with no permanent home, no real connections. I did my job well, but there was a hollowness to my life that I'd grown so accustomed to I barely noticed it anymore." His thumbs traced patterns on the backs of her hands. "Then I saw you standing tall despite everything they threw at you, and something inside me recognized something inside you. 2 survivors, shaped by different trials, but neither of us broken by them." He lifted one hand to her cheek, cradling it as if she were made of precious material. "I don't just love you," he continued. "I admire you, I respect you, and I promise you this: whatever life brings us, good or ill, we'll face it together. As equals, as partners, as 2 people who chose each other freely and completely." Tears pricked at Tamara's eyes, not tears of sorrow or pain, but of a joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. Without words, she leaned forward, meeting Brody's lips with her own in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, sealing the promises between them more effectively than any formal vow. When they finally parted, stars wheeling above them in the endless sky, Tamara felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find again. Here, in this place, with this man, she was no longer defined by what had happened to her, but by what she had survived and what she would build. They were married 2 days later in the small white church in Pleasant Valley, a town that indeed proved more welcoming than Redemption Springs had ever been. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by Thomas Richardson, who insisted on giving the bride away, and several of the Triple R hands who had already developed a respect for their new foreman and a protective fondness for his bride. As they exchanged their vows, Tamara in a new dress of pale blue cotton purchased from the local dressmaker, and Brody in his best shirt and trousers, the shadows of the past seemed to recede, making way for the bright promise of the future. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared with genuine warmth. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Their first kiss as husband and wife was met with cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the ranch hands. As they walked back down the aisle together, Tamara's hand tucked securely in the crook of Brody's arm, she felt a lightness in her step that had been absent for too long. Mrs. Vance, Brody murmured, the new name causing her heart to leap with joy. My wife. My husband, she replied, the words both strange and perfect on her tongue. The small celebration that followed at the town's only restaurant was filled with laughter and good wishes. Richardson proposed a toast to the newlyweds that brought unexpected tears to Tamara's eyes. To Brody and Tamara Vance, the older man said, raising his glass. May your union be blessed with the strength that comes from overcoming hardship, the wisdom that comes from compassion, and the joy that comes from finding your true partner in this life. As the evening drew to a close, they rode back to the Triple R in the wagon that Richardson had gifted them as a wedding present, a sturdy vehicle with a fresh coat of paint and their initials, B&TV, discreetly carved into the side panel. Their cabin welcomed them home, the lamplight golden through the windows as Brody lifted Tamara from the wagon seat and carried her across the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture. Inside, they found that someone, likely the cook's wife, had prepared the cabin for their return, with fresh flowers on the table, a bottle of wine with 2 glasses, and the bed turned down with clean linens. Welcome home, Mrs. Vance, Brody said, setting Tamara gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Home, Tamara repeated, looking around the simple cabin that already felt more like a true home than anywhere she'd been since losing her family. I like the sound of that. Later, as moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, Tamara lay in the circle of Brody's arms, her body still humming with the discovery of physical love between them, a joining as tender and passionate as she could have hoped for, unmarred by the shadows of her past or the cruelty she had endured. Happy? Brody asked softly, his fingers trailing gently along the bare skin of her arm. Completely, Tamara replied, nestling closer to his warmth. For the first time in so long, I'm not afraid of tomorrow or the day after or all the days to come. Brody pressed a kiss to her temple. That's as it should be, he murmured. The future is ours to shape now, together. As she drifted towards sleep, safe and loved in her husband's embrace, Tamara's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude, not just for having survived, but for having found, against all odds, a love that saw her scars as badges of honor rather than marks of shame. In the years that followed, the Triple R prospered under Brody's management as foreman, his natural leadership and fair treatment of the hands earning him respect throughout the territory. Tamara found her own place at the ranch, initially helping with the household management, but eventually taking over the ranch's accounts when her skill with numbers became apparent. Together, they built a life filled with purpose and love. Their cabin expanded with the addition of a larger kitchen and a proper second bedroom that became necessary when, a year after their wedding, Tamara gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, after Tamara's mother. 2 years later, a son joined their family, Thomas, honoring both Tamara's brother and Thomas Richardson, who had become a grandfatherly figure to their children. The pain of the past never completely vanished. There were still nights when Tamara woke trembling from nightmares of captivity or loss, but Brody was always there, his steady presence anchoring her to their shared reality. And as the years passed, the nightmares came less frequently, gradually replaced by dreams of the future. They rarely ventured to Redemption Springs, having no reason to visit a place that held such painful memories. But on the 5th anniversary of their wedding, curiosity and a desire for closure led them to make the journey. The town had changed little on the surface, though many faces were new. Mrs. Fletcher still ran the boarding house and greeted Tamara with genuine pleasure, marveling at the transformation from the haunted young woman she remembered to the confident, content wife and mother before her. Some attitudes, however, remained stubbornly fixed. There were still sideways glances and whispered comments as Tamara walked down the main street, her head held high and her husband at her side. Ed Simmons, now the town blacksmith following his father's death, made a point of spitting in the dust as they passed his shop. But this time, the judgment carried no weight. Tamara viewed it with the detachment of someone who had moved beyond the need for validation from such sources. These people, with their narrow minds and limited horizons, could no longer touch the life she had built. As they prepared to leave town, a young woman approached them hesitantly. Tamara recognized her as Jenny Wilson, Deputy Wilson's daughter, now grown into her 20s. "Mrs. Vance," Jenny said, her voice soft but determined. "I just wanted to tell you, your story helped me. When I was younger, I heard how people treated you after what happened to you, and I thought it was wrong even then, last year when I had my own troubles." She paused, gathering courage. "When my fiancé broke our engagement because someone forced themselves on me. I remembered how you held your head high despite what people said, how you found happiness anyway." Tamara felt her heart constrict at the young woman's words, the echo of her own pain reflected in Jenny's eyes. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," she said quietly. Jenny shook her head. "I'm leaving Redemption Springs soon, going to my aunt's in Denver, starting over." Her eyes shone with tentative hope. "I just wanted you to know that you showed me it could be done, that surviving doesn't make you less." "It makes you more," Brody said gently, repeating the words he had once spoken to Tamara. "Stronger, braver." Jenny nodded, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. "Exactly." She straightened her shoulders, visibly gathering her resolve. "Safe journey back to your ranch, Mr. and Mrs. Vance." As they watched her walk away, Tamara felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle of judgment and shame that had nearly broken her had been interrupted. Her example, her refusal to be defined by others' perceptions, had helped another woman find her own path to healing. "Ready to go home?" Brody asked, his hand finding hers with the same sureness it had on the day they met. "Yes," Tamara replied, turning away from Redemption Springs for what she knew would be the last time. "Let's go home." They never returned to the town after that day. Their life unfolded at the R, where they raised their children in an environment of love, respect, and acceptance. Sarah grew into a young woman with her father's steady confidence and her mother's quiet resilience, while Thomas inherited Brody's way with horses and Tamara's quick mind for figures. When Thomas Richardson passed away in his sleep at the age of 78, his will contained a surprise. He had left the R not to distant relatives back east as expected, but to Brody and Tamara, citing their dedication to the ranch and their understanding of its true value beyond mere property. The transition from foreman to owner brought new challenges and responsibilities, but the foundations they had built over the years served them well. Under their stewardship, the R continued to thrive, becoming known throughout the territory not just for the quality of its cattle, but for its fair treatment of workers regardless of race or background. As they entered their later years, with their children grown and building lives of their own, Brody and Tamara often sat together on the porch of their expanded cabin in the evenings, watching the sun set over the land that had become so much a part of them. "Did you ever imagine this?" Tamara asked one such evening, her hand resting comfortably in Brody's, the silver in their hair catching the last rays of the setting sun. "That day in Redemption Springs when you defended a stranger against a town's cruelty." Brody considered the question, his blue eyes still bright despite the lines that time had etched around them. "Not this exactly," he admitted, "but I knew my life had changed the moment I saw you standing there, refusing to be broken by their spite." He squeezed her hand gently. "You were the bravest person I'd ever met. You still are." Tamara smiled, the expression coming easily now after decades of happiness that had gradually worn away the sharp edges of her early trauma. "We saved each other, I think. You gave me a way out, but you also gave me a way forward, a reason to believe in goodness again. And you gave me a home," Brody replied simply. "Not just this place, but here." He placed their joined hands over his heart, where it matters most. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Tamara leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, grateful beyond words for the journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that had begun in judgment and cruelty, but had led, against all odds, to a life of such profound love and meaning that the scars of the past, while never forgotten, had been transformed into the foundation of their shared strength. They had both been spat upon, she for what she had survived, he for choosing to stand beside her. But together, they had built something that could never be diminished by the small-mindedness of others, a love that had not merely endured but had flourished, growing deeper and richer with each passing year. And in the end, that was the truest form of triumph.